Welcome once again to our discourse this morning. The topic that we have this morning is Discover Your Highest Potential. And I suspect, having known Swami Kriyananda for many years, that that title was inspired by something that Swami Kriyananda would sometimes speak about. And he was a traveler, a world traveler, doing discourses around the world. And many years ago, he had visited Australia, and he was doing a lecture tour in Australia. And he did one program there, and I don't know the specifics of what he was speaking about, but I'm sure he was talking about God, and he was talking about our need for God, and how to find God, and the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. And this was to an Australian audience. And one gentleman came up after the discourse and said in a very heavy Australian accent, which Swamiji at this point in the story would mimic, because he was very good at mimicking accents of whatever country it might be. But he said, "I am an Australian, or I'm an atheist. I'm an atheist. What would you have to say to me and about God?" And Swami said, "Well, why don't you think about God as your own highest potential?" And the man thought about it for a moment. He says, "Well, that's good for me. That'll do it for me." And he agreed that it was a good topic. And over the years, I've found that very useful, because many times you run into people that they're not believers in divinity, but if you use that phrase, the highest potential, it's actually quite good, because think about it. What is your highest potential? If you're an artist, you can always be a better artist. If you're a scientist, you can always be a better scientist. If you're a tradesman, if you're a craftsman, whatever it is that we do, you can always do it a little bit better. There's probably some point, I don't think there is a point where you ever reach that I can't do this even better. And more and better is the watchword often of a devotee. And I think it's a good one. And you might say that principle, that it's infinity. We can always improve, and if you think about that, meditate on that, it can actually be what it is. Truly, what we're trying to find in life is we're trying to find our highest potential. What is it? Now, I'm going to leave that, at least for now, for you to consider. What is your highest potential? Because I think perhaps the more important question we want to address today is, how do we realize our highest potential, whatever it might be? Because you may want to define your highest potential differently than somebody else, your neighbor. But I think the ability to reach our highest potential on some level is common to all of us. We tend to think, well, outwardly, my highest potential, if it's in some outward expression, we tend to think in that way, outwardly becoming better and better at some outward thing. But really, if you follow it back, you'll see that reaching your highest potential is something inward, becoming a better whatever it is, but particularly becoming a better person, becoming more accomplished, becoming a better human being. And that's something that all of us share together. And the question is, how? How do we do something? Now, this seems like a very prosaic question, simple question of how do I do that. But the very question of asking how is very meaningful. And what I wanted to speak a little bit today, I'm going to digress and speak about what happens to be momentarily of interest to me, and hopefully I'll get back to the topic and tie it in. But I have been reading. I enjoy reading about science and things like that, of the natural world. And I read an interesting fact the other day that started making me think about just the magnificence of this world and how it all works. And the writer pointed out that this world is mostly space. It seems so very solid. We say, and all of us assume this to be quite a solid floor that we're sitting on. And it's very hard when we run into something, we have an accident. It seems very hard, but it's actually space. It's not solid at all. And the fact was pointed out, which I found quite interesting to contemplate. They were saying the very simplest atom should be a hydrogen atom. And I think from our science class we know that that's one proton and one electron. And that proton is in the nucleus. And if we were to imagine a proton to be, let's say, about this big, an inch, let's say 1 inch or a couple of centimeters, the nearest, that one electron, if you were to do it by scale, would probably be about 3 or 4 kilometers away. Now, we sort of think, were you in science class where you had to make the model and you put there and you put this electron sort of going around the ring and on a piece of paper, but really that electron had to be way over in the neighboring village and probably beyond. And I thought, that's really amazing. How is it possible if it's space? Why don't things just go together like this? Why do things stay apart, and why does it seem very solid? Well, that one electron over in the neighboring village is revolving around that proton almost at the speed of light, very, very fast. And it's going all around it so fast that it gives the illusion of solidity. And it's like the image that this writer used. He said, all of us have at some time played with fireworks, I suspect, when we were children. And sparklers, you have a sparkler and you light the sparkler at night, and what do you do with the sparkler? You don't just hold it and look at it. You go like this with it, right? And if you go fast enough, what does it look like? It looks like a circle of light, that you're making a circle of light. Well, imagine you're going, it seems like it's quite fast, but imagine you were doing that at the speed of light. And it just creates this aura of light around that very tiny little center. And this aura of light that surrounds each one of those protons is a field, a force field, you could say. And it looks solid to the eye, perhaps, if we could see such things. It looks solid. But that field is very powerful, and another one coming up against it cannot penetrate it. And so it seems very, very solid. So I was reading these types of things and other types of facts, and I began to wonder how is it possible that people can know these things? I mean, how do you know that? I mean, how do they know these things? And that is a characteristic of the age that we find ourselves in. People have asked that question of how can I, or of what and why, and this inquiring mind has asked these questions, and we take it for granted that this is what people do. I want to know how this works, but it hasn't always been that way. And this is a point I'd like to mention, is that we live in an age today that we take for granted, but if you were to go back in time, not very far, just a few hundred years, it would not have been the same. Commonly, people wouldn't have asked these types of questions. And there's a story that from the life of a very famous scientist who you probably heard of. His name was Galileo. Italian man. Lived about 4 centuries ago, maybe a little about that time, in the 1600s in Italy. And there's an experiment that he's famous for, which is probably actually didn't happen, as the historians say, this really didn't happen, but it was probably a thought experiment. But I like it the other way, that it actually did happen, is that he lived in central Italy, and the story was that he went to the top of the Tower of Pisa, and there from the Tower of Pisa he dropped two objects, two balls. I bet many of you have heard this in science class. And one ball was very heavy. Maybe it was a cannonball, I don't know. And the other ball was about the same size, but it was light. And he went to the top to drop them, and he said that the two balls would fall and hit the ground at the same time. But common thought in those days was, and people might think, oh, the cannonball is going to fall faster. You see, it's heavy, so it would fall faster and it will hit the ground faster. Now that's what your common thinking might say. You think so? See, we still think that way. But actually, no. He drops them and they hit the ground at the same time. And there's a principle of scientific principle associated with that. Now, that seems quite interesting. It's an interesting thing to contemplate. But the commonly held view that one would fall faster than the other was postulated by Aristotle, who had lived 1,500 years before that time. But it wasn't until that time, in Galileo's time, that somebody actually tested it. They had gone a millennia and a half accepting something that could be easily tested as to be the truth, because Aristotle said so. Famous man, he said so, must be so. Reminds me of that story of Paramahansa Yogananda when he, during the Second World War, he lived in Los Angeles, and he was he wanted to build a church there, and he began to build a church. But during that time of the war, there was rationing was taking place, and they couldn't find materials. They wouldn't allow such construction to take place because it was non-essential to the war effort. But so what he found was a house or a building that he could move. So somehow they had the equipment, and they took an old building, moved it to the new location, and fixed it up and made a church out of it. But as time went by, when it got to the point of fixing the windows, he wanted some very beautiful windows. He wanted stained glass windows. And it didn't have, stained glass windows were very difficult to find, and it was not possible to have them made at that time. So he went to various rummage sale type places, junkyards, second-hand places, looking for them. And he was intuitively guided to a certain junkyard that you might say Divine Mother guided him, that he would find his windows there. And he went there, and there was a workman working there, and he asked the workman, he says, I'm looking for some stained glass windows. Do you have anything like that? And the man says, no, we don't have anything like that. And he says, are you sure? And he says, no, and then like that. And you don't have any. No, we don't have any. And the phrase that came to mind is the boss says no, must be no. Boss says no, must be no. Well, finally, of course, Master says, well, let's go look. And very reluctantly, the man took Master through the various places. And he says, well, how about over there, maybe in that area? Oh, no, boss says no, must be no. And they went, and behind there, they're all hidden by the dust and the debris, there was a whole set of very beautiful stained glass windows, which Yogananda purchased and had installed in his church. But that phrase, boss says no, must be no. Aristotle said so, must be so. Well, this marked a bit of a revolution, because that same Galileo then, a little bit later, he began to invent a telescope, one of the first ones to have a telescope, and he trained that telescope on Jupiter, and he noticed something. He noticed that Jupiter had moons going around it, and you can still see these moons. They're the four brightest of the moons of Jupiter, the Galilean moons. And from that he postulated, he saw that they were rotating, and he postulated also that the sun was the center of our solar system, and our planet went around the sun. And this was Copernicus's thought also. And this created a furor in the hierarchy of the church at that time, and he was somewhat excommunicated, or not, perhaps he wasn't excommunicated, but he was imprisoned in his house under house arrest for many years after, until he renounced. He had to renounce that teaching because Scripture didn't seem to indicate that. And people observing something that might be contrary to it, it was not accepted. Something that in today's world, if we see something, it's the reality of seeing something versus what is said. Somebody had reported that, we take that to heart and we follow that. I have a friend who is a very well-known, internationally well-known naturalist, and he loves to watch birds and categorize birds. And he was saying that in the Audubon Society, which is a bird society, there is a phrase that they use there. He says, when you're out in the field looking at birds, if you see a bird that belongs to a certain species, and you know it does, and perhaps that the book says it has 6 spots on its tail, and you notice that it only has 5 spots on its tail, which one do you believe? And there's a phrase in the Audubon Society, says, when the bird in the book and the bird that you're observing differ, go by the bird. Believe the bird rather than the book. Now, this seems obvious to us, but it wasn't necessarily always that way. That this is a modern way of thinking. And at about that time, 300-400 years ago, something began to change in the way people began to relate. And after Galileo, a short time after, perhaps 4 or 5 decades later, there was another, you might say, revolution in scientific thought. And there was a book was published that is probably one of the most influential scientific books ever published. And it was written by Isaac Newton. It was called Principia Mathematica. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard that. Probably none of us have read it. But it had a tremendous impact. And that book ushered in what has now come to be known as the scientific age. What Newton postulated in those, or formulated in those books, was what's now known as the laws of motion. And he also invented a new style of mathematics, which happens to be calculus. Others did it as well simultaneously. And calculus measures things that are in motion. And this had a tremendous impact upon science at that time. And in Europe, you could say right at about that time, scientific thought began to be formulated, and at the same time it entered in an age which is now looked back upon as that age was the beginning of what is called the Enlightenment in Europe, the age of Enlightenment in Europe, which meant, now of course not enlightenment the way we think about it, but it was enlightened in the sense that light was shining into the way people thought, the way people looked at the world, and they began to look at it rationally based upon observation and based upon experience and based upon what they saw in front of them, instead of the reliance upon Scripture, the reliance upon what had been passed down. they accepted that, but a thought came into people, which is important for us. I'll get to that. Which is important for us in that you accept something, but you test it. You accept something and you look to see, is it applicable? Does it work? Is it true? Can I apply that in my own life? And this way of thinking was revolutionary at that time. In the European tradition, there was also simultaneously there was a spiritual revolution that took place called the Reformation, where people began to say, I'm not going to accept a hierarchy telling me what my relationship is with God, or in this case with Christ, but I have to formulate that personal relationship, one individually with divinity, rather than through a hierarchy of an organizational institution. And this mode of thought also reflected the importance of the individual, the importance of the individual's personal experience of life, and the importance of observation and testing what we see in life. And now this seems very commonplace to us, but it wasn't at that time. And it ushered in a revolution, and it ushered in the beginning of something extraordinary that began to happen. And this is the age of scientific thought. That, yes, of course science existed somewhat before that, but a tremendous acceleration began to happen until now we can know that proton and that electron, or whatever the distance is between those two. This is where that comes from. Now, interestingly, something else was happening. Why was this happening right about then? Now, our guru's guru, Swami Sri Yukteswar, he wrote a very deep philosophical or practical book, not so much philosophy, called The Holy Science. He wrote this in the last part of the 19th century, in the 1890s. And in that book, he made some very interesting observations. As opposed to what is commonly accepted here in India in terms of the cycles of time, which are known as yugas, of being very, 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 very long cycles. And it's commonly held thought that we are now in Kali Yuga. And this is often, you hear this and commonly passed on in discourse. But Sri Yukteswar challenged that. And he said, no, we're not in Kali Yuga anymore. Kali Yuga is the dark age. It's an age of material consciousness. It's an age when we think in terms of solid matter. It's an age of form. It's an age of structure. It's an age of darkness. But Sri Yukteswar made an interesting statement. He said, no, we have passed out of Kali Yuga, that we're now in the second age, which is known as Dwapara Yuga. And this is a different age. And he gave many reasons for why he made that assertion. And I'll let you read the book on your own rather than explaining those. But he said that the world had moved out of Kali Yuga in the year 1700. Very interesting. And right prior to that, he says when the ages change, and he defined Kali Yuga in a much shorter cycle than in what is traditionally postulated of hundreds of thousands of years. He was saying, yeah, there could be such long cycles as well, but he said there's also shorter cycles of 12,000 years, of which Kali Yuga, in this case, is 1,000 years, but on each end has transitionary years of 100 years. And so there's a descending Kali Yuga and an ascending Kali Yuga, which we passed through. And he said we had reached the bottom point in about the year 500 AD. And that we had then, I have my math right? But anyway, somehow that has to get up to 1700. Oh, I know. Yeah, because there's this transitionary period between Kali Yuga and then we move into Dwapara Yuga, which also has a transitional phase. So at the year 1700, there was a change of yugas was beginning to take place. And Dwapara Yuga is characterized not by solid matter and solidity, but it's characterized more by energy, by vibration, by finer currents. And at that point, there would be a transition, and mankind would begin to enter into an age that was reflective outwardly of Dwapara Yuga. And this transitionary phase would go until the year 1900, roughly, approximately 1900. Then we would enter fully into Dwapara Yuga. So it's very interesting. You see, in the West, of course, this was these scientists I've been mentioning would be the Europeans, but the movement and the transition of ages is like a wave, and a wave has a low point, then it has a high point, then it has a low point, and that wave hits the shore. First, the leading edge of that wave comes, and then the full wave itself comes, and then the tail end of it. So consequently, that leading edge, in relationship to science, hit those shores at that point in Europe at that time. But by this time, and we've seen it take place in history, that full wave is now spread throughout the world. And we live now in a scientific age, that modern science is now permeates the thinking of people in every country, that we're fully engaged with it. And this transition has had tremendous impact on how we look upon life. We don't look upon it so much in terms of institutions and solidity and organizational structures, but yes, we certainly do to some degree, but we're beginning to look at life more in terms of energy itself. One of Swami Sri Yukteswar's predictions, and remember, he was making this prediction in the 1890s, before Einstein came, who revolutionized Newton's laws of motion and took them to an even deeper understanding. Before that time, Sri Yukteswar had predicted, he said, in the age to come, we will discover many finer electricities. And this will become the currency, you might say, the current way that we understand life is through finer energies will be discovered. He even predicted even further in time that an age is beyond, the next age is beyond Dwapara. But that's not necessarily concerning us here now. But we live in this age of energy, and it's in this age of energy that these teachings of Kriya Yoga, these teachings that have been brought from Babaji through Lahiri Mahashaya, through Swami Sri Yukteswar, and ultimately through our Guru to us. It's in this age that these teachings have been brought that are in sync and in resonance with this age that we're living in. This is why these techniques and these teachings have been introduced and brought into the world today. Babaji says in the autobiography of a yogi, he says there are many, many souls, countless souls, millions of souls, thousands of souls, whatever the number is, who are eager and seeking for God realization, waiting to come into this world at this time. And this technique of Kriya that he gave to Lahiri Mahashaya at his initiation, he said, you will be the instrument to transmit these teachings out to many, many souls will be touched by this technique of Kriya in this age because of the call of those souls. And what you find is that in any age, when the ages begin to change, souls begin to incarnate into that age who are in tune, you might say who vibrate in accordance with that time. And so what you find today is that you find it's a time of great change, tremendous change, and that change is accelerating. It's not, we think of it because our lifetime is short. we think of it as somewhat a constant pace of change. But it's accelerating change. It changes faster and faster and faster. And you see young people now being born into this age who don't come in with the same way of relating as perhaps we did when we were born. They come in because they're souls that are in tune with this age and will express and intuitively understand. We still, those of us, perhaps I'm a little older than some, but I think this applies to all of us. We have come out of a darker age, Kali Yuga, a time of form, a time of matter, a time of institutions, a time of Aristotle said so, must be so, received wisdom, or received dogma, you might say, not necessarily wisdom, received the dogma. And so consequently, societally, we have inherited that way of looking at life. So even though we have moved up into a more energetic age, into an age that is more in tune with energy, the models that we use and our thinking, the foundation of our thinking is still based upon an old understanding. And so we try to fit the new understanding of energy, of Dwapara ways of relating to this life. We try to fit them into the old model because enough time hasn't gone by. Yes, a couple hundred years perhaps, but that's really not very long. It's going to take much longer than that. So we're still using the old model and trying to fit the new into that, and somehow it doesn't quite work perfectly. But as time passes, as the centuries pass, and I do say centuries, not necessarily one lifetime or two, but as this age progresses, we'll begin to leave that old model of form and structure and institutionalism behind. But inevitably, when you pass from one age into another age, there is going to be stress. And we see that in the world today. There is stress. And some people, I'm not one of them, although I momentarily do become discouraged. But I think about it and I think, yes, any type of growth is stressful. Any type of change is leaving one thing behind and moving to something else. It's going to cause displacement. And so you have to, you have to take the changes that you see happening in this world philosophically. But taking the teachings and the predictions of Sri Yukteswar to heart, I see it as ultimately for the good. It's positive. It's moving in an upward. We're in an upward moving age toward greater understanding and greater enlightenment and greater awareness. And so when I see the difficulties that sometimes come, you see its resistance. I mentioned a little bit earlier, there was in Europe, you had the Reformation about 400 years ago, 400 years ago. It was followed by the Counter-Reformation, in other words, the reaction to it, and consequently warfare happened. But in time, it resolved itself. And now that we don't, at least in Europe, they don't, well, I'm not sure, maybe they do fight about such things still, but it's those, you might say, a little bit more gross expressions of that passed by. I hope that's the case. But certainly we have passed through this last century. It's been a very chaotic time. But yet the masters have predicted that in the future these things will improve and mankind's understanding will become harmonized, and that this world which is fractured with one country against the other country, misunderstandings one from the other, will be brought into harmony as we move into Dwapara. The differences of space between one country and another, and the miscommunication from one country to another, these will be transcended in the coming age. So in that sense, it's hopeful. But for our purposes, Kriya and meditation will play a role in that. Because the gurus of our path, and not only our path, but of other paths, have all asserted that each of us, it's our nature, it's our soul nature to want to fulfill our highest potential. This is a calling that's embedded. It's a seed thought. Within each one of us, we want to express that highest potential. We want to come out. But in this age, we are not going to be satisfied strictly with somebody said it to be so, doctrine, ritual, all of these outer forms. What we want to have in our lives is we want to have direct experience. Is it so? I'm not going to take your word for it. I'll take it tentatively, but I won't take it definitively until I have tested it for myself. And this, I think, is the way that those of us who practice these teachings of the gurus, of our line of masters, approach it. Yes, we approach it with a devotional heart, but there's also this, because we're born in this age, we also approach it from this, you might say, scientific point of view. Now, in the common world today, I mentioned that we're still working, although we're looking to the future, this world of energy, Dwapara Yuga, we're still burdened by the past because that's the box in which we try to fit things. And so you have the age of Kali was defined by materialism, material matter. That matter is the essential reality. And what we've seen over the last few centuries is this age of science, challenging that or affirming that or testing that. If you put those two together, what you have is you have the phrase scientific materialism. And this is the dominant philosophy of science today. It's scientific materialism. In other words, everything is a function of matter. Or, because of quantum physics, you might say a function of matter energy, whatever that is. And so this is the basic reality. And consciousness is but an expression of matter and electricities in the brain producing consciousness, whereas the yogi says something quite differently. The yogi says consciousness is the reality, and matter is but a lower vibration and expression of consciousness. But how do we know which one of these two is true? How do we know which one of these is true? Do we take somebody's word for it? I think if you've been listening so far, you'd say, no, we don't. We don't take somebody's word for it. We test it ourselves. And that is why we have these teachings of yoga. And this is why yoga is the science that is appropriate for this age to test, to see if any of this is true. And so if we approach meditation, if we approach yoga, if we're interested in these types of teachings, I challenge you to do it from a scientific perspective, adding to it a bit of devotional belief of the heart, the better part, you might say, the better part of the past, the devotional side, bringing that, but yet even there, test it. Test what you want of your beliefs. Test your devotion. Ask and see if it's true. This was a point that Paramahansa Yogananda made to his disciples and in his teachings. He says, we want to be objective. There's one of the things I notice in teaching and discussing these types of things with people. I told this story last night. I was doing a webinar, but I thought it applied and I want to repeat it today. Is oftentimes you hear people, particularly if they're spiritually inclined, they say things that you wonder if they're truly real or not real. Are they they're fanciful. And oftentimes fantasy takes the place of reality in people's meditation and their spiritual practices. But Paramahansa Yogananda was very grounded. he says, you need to test whatever your spirituality must stand, be able to stand in the cold light of day. And test your spirituality, test your experience to see if it is true. The story that came to mind last night when we were talking about a little bit different subject, but it came to mind was a man had come to Paramahansa Yogananda for an interview, and they went to his room in his hotel where he was traveling, and he was staying at a hotel. Went to the room, and the man had said that he had the ability to astrally travel. He could enter into a trance state, and in his astral body be able to travel anywhere he so chose. And of course, this is something you read about in literature, spiritual literature, and I think there's some basis of truth to this. If you're of a certain caliber of yogi, and to be able to do that, to be able to disassociate the physical from the physical and use your astral body. So this man had this claim that he would travel here and he would travel there in his astral body. And so Yogananda said, oh, well, that's interesting. Please demonstrate. So the man said, okay. And he sat down and he went into something of what he called a trance. But Yogananda was a little bit skeptical because the fellow's eyes were, restless and blinking, and he was sort of fidgeting, which is not indicative of being in a superconscious state. But Yogananda nevertheless persisted. He says, well, where are you? And the man said, I am now sitting on the dome of the Taj Mahal. And Yogananda said, sir, I think your dome is cracked. I see you sitting right here in front of me. And opened his eyes, and he was a little bit indignant, that Yogananda would question him. But in his mind, I suspect he was mentally imagining himself on the dome of the Taj Mahal. And so, but Yogananda told him, he says, it's your subconscious imagination. You must be able to distinguish between these two. And the man was very indignant, and Yogananda says, let's test. Let's test. And so Yogananda said, we're in this very nice hotel. On the ground floor of the hotel, there's a very nice restaurant. He says, I want you to astrally travel down to the restaurant and tell me what you see. And that's okay. So he went there and he went down to the restaurant in his astral body, I suppose. And he went there and he says, I see, and he described this person there, and the whole surroundings and the people that were there in the restaurant. And then Yogananda said, okay. And then Yogananda went into a meditative state. And he said, I see, and he described it completely differently. He says, now let us go. So they got in the elevator and the lift, went down, and whose do you suppose was correct? It was just as Yogananda had seen. This person was there, that person who dressed in such and such an attire was there. It was just exactly as he saw it, not exactly at all. And the man who was supposedly astral traveling was shocked. He couldn't believe it. He said, he was wrong. But you see, he had never bothered to test his experiences. He had never bothered to test his experiences. There was one time that Yogananda had a spiritual experience, and he said that he had this experience of Divine Mother, and it was very meaningful and absolutely real. It was a real experience. But yet, he said, I want to know, is this really real? Or am I just imagining this? You see, even a master, an avatar, he asked himself, he says, I don't want to just be fooled by imagination. Divine Mother, if this is real, you must give me a sign, a way to test. And so, basically, he received the message back from the Divine that throughout, I will place in this room, there will be a perfume. And whoever comes into this room a load of lotuses, I believe it was, that they will be able to detect that. And so, he went about his day, and all day long, people would come to visit him for interview, whatever, and they'd come in, and they'd walk in the door and say, "Wow, what is that beautiful smell that is here today? It smells like lotuses," and Yogananda said nothing. You see, Yogananda said nothing, but people, person after person, would come and comment on it. And so Yogananda, the point here is Yogananda himself, a master, would test to see. He encouraged us. He encouraged us to stand with an open mind, but yet an inquiring mind, with a faithful mind also, and test what you're doing so that you keep your feet on the ground. He says, this is the age in which we live in, and this is the teachings of Kriya Yoga. He said, these teachings of Kriya are scientifically, in a spiritual sense, testable. If we practice Kriya Yoga, we can, as he said, if we practice correctly, they're like mathematics. You see, they, like Newton, the language of mathematics. But now there is a little caveat in that. A little caveat. You said, if you practice correctly. It's like Yogananda's story that he says, I can make any boys of the whatever disposition or temperament, however off they may be, into saints within a certain number of years, if they practice what I say correctly as I teach it to them. Well, of course, that's the catch, as far as for practicing it as he teaches. So how many people will actually do that? Yogananda and I was just reading a little bit in the book Nejda about him. He would go up into his attic room at Forgarpar Road, and he would meditate. He says sometimes he'd meditate 24 hours straight, 36 hours straight, 48 hours straight. I've never meditated 48 hours straight, nor 36, nor 24. That's an amazing. But of course, he was totally absorbed in the divine ecstasy, and to be able to have that experience, then it becomes something else when you reach that point. But nevertheless, if we practice these techniques, we'll find that we're transformed. Now, I want to give you a few suggestions. All of us either meditate, or we're thinking about meditation, or we're interested in meditation. Probably we wouldn't be here if we didn't at least have some interest. And I'd like to mention just a few comments. If you meditate, just to come back to this topic of discovering your highest potential, a person might think, well, I really don't want to meditate because I don't want to become a Himalayan yogi, or I don't want to become like whatever impression you might have. But what you will become if you pursue the spiritual life systematically is you'll become you at a higher octave, and eventually potentially at the highest octave. You don't become somebody else. You become who you are, really. Now you say, well, who? And then I would ask the question, who are you, really? And you look and you say, well, I'm Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so, and I live in this address, and I'm Indian, or I'm, what are you? European of some background, or American. Is that really who we are? It's not really who we are, but we have taken on these clothing of culture, of clothing of personality, and we identify with that. What meditation does is it makes us realize who we really are. Now, we're none of those things, really. But yet, each of us have our own individual karma, our own individual personality, our own individual way of relating to this world. That doesn't change. We become, each one is unique, and we become that to the highest octave. And so this is what we want to do when we to express who we are, not in the sense of ego, but our nature at that highest octave. And you find that no two people are exactly alike. Paramahansa Yogananda was not like Swami Sri Peshwar, his guru. His guru, very different outward expression. But underneath, there was something there. They were both God realized. And that's what we want, is to become realized in the divine highest sense. And then allow that, like light shining through one of those stained glass windows, to be able to express itself very uniquely. So let's approach this, but we can approach this technique of Kriya Yoga, this technique of meditation, in a scientific manner, a systematic manner. Now, if we look at the life, let's start by looking at the lives of great saints, when those who transcended, those who were the highest caliber. We noticed all of them stressed the ability to be still. Be still and know God. Be still. Look at the Buddha. You know, they look at the in the Bhagavad Gita, be thou a yogi, Arjuna. Christ going off in his meditations it's always expressed in learning to be still. Now, stillness of body, stillness of mind, stillness of heart. We're not just talking about outwardly, is the ability to be still. And you'll see that universally, this is something that all the great saints had been able to achieve, this ability. And for those of you who are just beginning your meditation practice, or those of you who are perhaps a little bit more experienced in meditation, I would ask you to think about this. Think about that. Think about stillness. If you can be absolutely still, you'll begin to experience a different reality. Do you know there's just from looking at meditation from a scientific point of view, there is a point in the brain, it's up here, somewhere up in the top of the head. There's a point in the brain there, it's called the orientation association area of the brain. You heard about that part of the brain? It's a part of the brain that is up there, and what it does is it orients the body in space. So you always know your sense of placement in physical space, where you are, your sense that you're inside this body is here on this ground, and it always orients you somehow. You identify with this physical world around you. When you begin to meditate, and this has been demonstrated by scientists, for example, a group of Buddhist monks, they hooked them up to various electrodes and injected them with various dyes. And they noticed, looking on the screen, that as they went into deep meditation, this area began to become very quiet and still. And they begin to go beyond the sense. When that happens, it becomes, we lose our sense of body consciousness. But it comes only when you're absolutely still. Now, interesting, they also hooked this up to nuns in Catholic monasteries or convents, monasteries, very devotional practices. And they asked them to pray very deeply and to do their practices. And they went into their deep prayerful state. And the same thing happened. This area becomes very quiet. And they too transcend this sense of body consciousness. And what do we read when we study meditation? We see, what are we trying to do? We're trying to transcend this identity of I am this body. I am this. This ego is said to be the soul identified with the body. And you'll see in any deep state of meditation, if you can become so quiescent that you begin to transcend this body awareness, you begin to then go into a deep state of meditation. And if you meditate and you have not been able to attain that, I would say you're probably not still. You're probably not still. And you need to work on it. Go deeper into stillness. Now, stillness is of the body, but it's also of the mind. And it's also of the heart as well. You have to have those still. So the second element that if you need to combine with that, if we're just still, it's not enough. We also have to positively absorb ourselves into something, because the stillness, you might say, makes us become quiet, but we also have to aspire to something. The life force, the vibration of the body begins to quiet. But then, as we say in yoga, we draw ourselves inward and upward. We also need to have a focus and a direction of where we're going. So meditation combines that. We become very still, and then we direct the energy upward to the point between the eyebrows, or it's certainly in an upward direction. So consequently, this is why if you pray, it gives focus, and you can absorb yourself upward. If you meditate and you focus on the point between the eyebrows, you give yourself focus towards something. If you combine these two, direct focused absorption into something combined with stillness, you'll find that you begin to interiorize the mind. And it's something that is universal, and it doesn't matter so much what you believe. These will help you in your meditation. And this is for those people here who are beginning meditation. If you want to go deeper, keep these two in mind. Start with the body, and very naturally the others will begin to follow. The teachings that have been brought to us of our particular path are the teachings of Kriya Yoga. And these teachings have been, as I said, developed and brought to us in this age because they're the appropriate techniques for now. They allow each of us individually to have a direct experience if we go deep within. And from that direct experience, we'll begin to see and experience that which I've been telling you today. And you don't have to take it on faith or belief. Here at Ananda, in the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda, we start people by learning to meditate and then becoming aware of the energy that's within the body, and then developing that energy and focusing that energy inward and upward, and then developing those areas of devotion, those areas of focused attention, and also eventually practicing the techniques of Kriya Yoga. I'd like to see it. How many of you are practicing Kriya Yoga now? Most of you? Oh, well, about half. There's about half. I suspect that you probably are interested. You're interested in this. And in the practice of Kriya Yoga, what you're going to do is you're going to interiorize. You're going to use a very powerful technique to withdraw the life force deeper within you, and then begin to develop, to direct that life force up to the brain. Yoga was introduced in this age because it speaks a language and it's a science that's in harmony with Dwapara Yuga. And the tradition of yoga, of course, is not that it's nothing new. It's said to be descended from Dwapara Yuga on the other side of the cycles. And so it's descended from a high age. The cycles and yugas of time go up and down and up and down. And so in the darker ages, that knowledge that is perhaps intuitively understood in a higher age is not being able to understand. It can only be understood by the common man in reference to the quality of thinking of that age. And so now that we're moving into a higher age, yoga itself concerns itself with prana, with life force. And this is a subtler concept that is very difficult for people in a darker age in Kali Yuga to understand. But now that we're in a higher age, people, of course, energy. We speak about energy as if it's such a common thing. Oh yes, I have lots of energy today. Well, what does that mean? You know, and you wouldn't have said that a few hundred years ago. It just wouldn't have had any meaning to a person. But now we speak about energy as if it's some substance that I can, you know, have in the jar or in the petrol tank. But it's actually very subtle because it's not substantial. I once asked Swami Kriyananda, I says, what is energy? If you really think about it, what is it? It's not an it, you see. It's not an it. It's something else. It's not physical. And he answered. It was a good little discussion and he said his feeling that energy is actually an astral concept. It's not a physical concept, and we have to think of energy as not in material ways, but it's an astral concept, and you could say that energy is the entry point, the easiest force, you might be able to say, of the astral world. To be able, if we understand energy, we understand prana, we begin to understand the subtler realities of the subtler worlds in which we are not materially conscious, but yet are there surrounding us. And so when we speak about energy, we're really speaking about a finer reality. And it's a very important concept when we speak about yoga. And as those of you who are Kriya Yogis, who know a little bit about the use of energy in our meditation practices, but even those just who are beginning to meditate, is think of yourself as energy more than this physical body. We're something subtler. We emanate a certain vibration just by our thoughts, by our personalities, that which is flowing through us. We vibrate in a certain way, and people, we know this to be true intuitively because we can feel one another in some vibrational sense. And this is not imagination. This is something that if you make yourself sensitive, you can understand one another vibrationally much more than just physically what a person says or how they look. And this is the way that as we move into these higher ages, we'll begin to refine that ability of relating one another in terms of energy. But we can start right now. And this is what yoga and in yoga techniques, yoga meditation, this is what we're tuning into, those subtler forces. Swami Sri Yukteswar and Paramahansa Yogananda himself also said in this coming age, Kriya is going to play, or techniques like it. I wouldn't want to just limit it just simply to our tradition, but Kriya and related such techniques are going to play a role because they give people the experience of their divine nature and who they really are. And it's only in that way will people be able to achieve outwardly peace in this world. Because as long as we see ourselves as different and we recognize one another according to our differences, Poland, right? It's Poland. I remember Poland. Or, Bengal or Chinese or whatever, America, Mexican. If we see each other in those terms, there's always going to be conflict. But when we begin to see our essential unity between one person and another, it's only then will mankind be able to truly achieve outwardly peace. But as long as we see ourselves in terms of differences, we won't be able to achieve that. But his predictions were, in this age, we will come to that time where people will be able to transcend those outward differences, but it's going to come from within. Does not mean we shouldn't try outwardly as well, but nevertheless, it only will be able to be truly achieved when we can come to that, bridge those differences inwardly. And this is what you feel when you begin to meditate. You begin to feel that, yes, others that are in the room, we're all brothers and sisters in this same light of the divine. Now, I want you to, if you can, have some questions, and let's see if we can answer those questions, or certainly we'll take the discussion in the direction that your questions indicate. Now, I know we always come to this point when there's going to be a difficulty of the first person raising their hand to ask a question, but maybe I'll have to ask our staff members to be one of those to ask a question. Oh, there's a good question. What is the question?
So, from what I've heard of the yugas, there is Kali Yuga, then there's Treta Yuga, and then Dwapara.
Yeah.
So what happened to Treta Yuga?
Okay, well, okay. She's asking about the yugas, Kali, Dwapara, Treta, and Satya. You left Satya Yuga out. These, I'm going to refer you, which probably we have down in the bookshop down there. Go look in there's a book called The Holy Science. In the beginning of the book, I think it's in the introduction or the preface, certainly in the first 20 pages, Sri Teshwar outlines the yugas. And in that book, he gives length of time of those yugas and the mechanics, you might say, of those yugas. And each of the yugas expresses in certain ways. The Dwapara Yuga is not, which we're entering into. I've made it sound a bit, certainly I made it sound better than Kali Yuga, but you have to understand it also is not the high age. It's higher than Kali, and it's characterized by energy. There's an energetic quality to it, and because of that, you can see we are tuning ourselves to energy in this age. Treta Yuga is said to be more in tune with magnetism, and the Satya Yuga is more spiritual qualities, the higher consciousness of Satya Yuga. Each of these has a certain length of time associated with them, and Yogananda did predict in this Dwapara Yuga, and in the coming, I'm not exactly sure the time scale here, but in the coming millennia, let's say at least, that these boundary differences between nations will be transcended, and that you'll begin to see, and he predicted this for Europeans. He predicted that just when he was speaking in the United States at that time, he says, just as you have the United States of America, you will have the United States of Europe. And he predicted that. And so you've seen to come to pass within the last 20 years the European Union. And that ideal has begun to manifest itself. And he also had predicted that eventually you'll see more of the United States of other parts of the world as well. And eventually the world itself will come to some sort of a unity in an outward form. But again, he emphasized it's the inward that has to happen first. One of the qualities of Dwapara Yuga is the transcendence, you might say, the destruction of space. And by that, you might wonder, what does that mean, the destruction of space, overcoming of space, concept of space? But if you think about it, when he went from Calcutta to Boston in 1920 on a ship, I don't know quite how long it took him, but it probably was a couple of months. You can now fly from Delhi, Mumbai to Newark Airport in New York, and that takes you 15 hours. So you can see space has somehow been not overcome, but it's transcended to some degree. I suspect that will only go. It's not going to become longer probably in the future. It's going to become probably even shorter. Now how that will be, I don't know. But he predicted such. Said in Treta Yuga the concept of time will be overcome. How that expresses itself, I have no idea. Now I used to think, when I first heard these things, I said, "Oh, that's good. I'll be Dwapara Yuga, I'd like to see how we overcome space, how we overcome time. Not just a matter of waiting and I'll be reborn in those ages, and I'm fantasizing like this, you see. And then, but then it was, Swamiji pointed out, he said, you can't guarantee that for yourself. He says, because you may be perfectly in tune with the age right now that you're born in, but as Yogananda said, there are many other worlds to be reborn in, not just this one. And you're reborn into a world that resonates with your consciousness. So you may not get to see it. I may not get to see it. How are we going to transcend time if I don't, you see, change myself and evolve myself? Yogananda said, and when Swami Kriyananda, in answer to Swami Kriyananda, why do we keep coming back to the same world over and over and over again? And he said, oh no, you may come back for a time. He says, but if you kept reincarnating in that same world, he said, what would happen is you would begin to catch on. And you would catch on too quickly. And so consequently, in order to avoid that, he said, in this cosmos, and if you look at the science of it, you see the pictures of billions and billions of galaxies, billions and billions of stars in every galaxy. Certainly there are probably a lot of other places besides this little spot right here. I don't know, maybe other dimensions. I don't know, these types of things. But the yugas, they rise and they fall, but there probably are longer cycles as well, yugas within yugas. It's a long bit of time that we have in order to effect our liberation, but it need not take a long bit of time. The tradition, the scriptures say it takes 5 to 8 million lives to attain the state of where consciousness can be fit to inhabit a human form. And then once you're in the human form, of course, it can be quick, but more likely slow, because we take on ego, we take identification, we're not naturally progressing, and so we get ourselves into all sorts of trouble. And so Yogananda had said that there's as we know, there are the days of Brahma, long, very long cycles of time. He says, and souls can go through a complete day of Brahma and not find their liberation, and then have to, when the night of Brahma is followed again by another day of Brahma, souls are thrown out again. And Yogananda said one of the impelling forces that will direct us to want to find God and to find liberation is, after a while, this world takes on an excruciating sense of monotony for the soul, again and again and again. See that? What was that movie? The fellow keeps coming back. Groundhog Day. Yeah, it keeps being reborn again and again and again until it just can't stand it anymore. You want to escape and find your liberation. But until such time, this world's very interesting. As long as we find it interesting, we can explore. And until the time will come, we don't want that anymore. Yogananda, of course, I've been speaking a little bit scientifically today, but Yogananda was a master of devotion. And although he did say to test your truths, and don't take it lightly and just believe whatever comes along. He says, test it. But he was really a saint of devotion. And he just said, if you can just cry to the Divine Mother, just cry to the Divine Mother, ask her to come. She cannot resist. If your devotion is strong and you cry, she'll come to rescue. But you have to one-pointedly get to that point in our lives when we don't want anything else. And unfortunately, we do want lots of other things. We think we want that, but other things intrude. But when we come to the point where nothing else will satisfy us, God has to come to us at that time. And so keep that in mind. This is, when you meditate, meditation, I mentioned being still, I mentioned being focused, but one of the greatest focuses of, if you're taking up the meditation path, achieve that stillness through intense devotion of the heart. When you want something very intensely, you automatically become still. Saint Teresa of Avila said she prayed until she could no longer pray with words, except for wistful yearnings of the heart. And that's how we attract the divine to us, that we're so intent that it's just yearnings of the heart. And that draws us into that state of absolute stillness. The heart no longer is, you see, the heart is restless. And it wants lots of different things. And as long as it wants all those other things, it can't achieve that state that we're seeking. But if you follow it through the heart, I think that's probably the most successful way to practice your meditation. Other questions? I got off the yugas a little bit, but
I mean, while being spiritual, is it possible that it could really be, chasing your aspirations in the material world?
Okay. While being spiritual, is it possible to? Now you said chase your aspirations in the world, but maybe how about attain your aspirations in the world and catch them, catch them? And yes, it's true. That this is it's an excellent question, because it's a very common question that's underneath many of our doubts. Can I follow the spiritual life, but yet what about all my aspirations, all those desires, all those things I would like to achieve? And must I leave one in order to do the other? And that creates a certain void in the heart. Oh my gosh, I have to give everything up in order to meditate, in order to seek the spiritual life. I've got to put on sackcloth and throw away my shoes. It's not like that. It's not like that. But the secret is, I think the secret, and this is what the masters teach. And there's a wonderful line in the Bible that Jesus said. He said, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these other things will be added unto you." So the question is, we all have desires. Those desires must be fulfilled in order to be free of them. But the secret of the spiritual life is fulfill those desires in the right way. If you fulfill those desires on the highest octave of your potential, they will all get fulfilled in the right way, and they will come to you in the right way to fulfill them, and you will be a channel for being able to fulfill them without personal identification of your desires or your fulfillment. You let them happen through you. So this is why, if we know, there's a story in the autobiography of the yogi of not exactly a desire, but desires are just karma coming to you. The disciple, if you read the autobiography, he goes to Babaji, and Babaji takes a stick out of the fire and he burns him. And the other disciples are shocked that Babaji would seemingly be very cruel to him. And Babaji says, would you rather he had died, and he was burned, you see, but would you rather he had died in a raging fire? Because his karma was to be totally burnt and killed. But Babaji instead just burned him a little bit. That karma was satisfied. And so if we elevate our consciousness and uplift ourselves, that karma will have to happen, but the way we receive that karma is perhaps, let's say, from a tamasic state into a sattvic state. We'll receive that karma in a sattvic state, and it'll express itself, and we won't be quite as touched by it if it's a negative thing. Then the same thing, karma is not good or bad, it's just karma. You see, how we receive it is whether it's good or bad. But those desires that we have, if they're very strong, don't beat yourself because you have desires. Rather, find God first and let God determine when and how those desires will be fulfilled. And so you elevate your consciousness and try to fulfill those good desires, asking God to help you fulfill those good desires, and they'll come in their own time. But seek first, and then the desires are fulfilled in the right way, and in the right time, and in the right manner. So you'll find we all have our natures, and we have to act in this world. We can't avoid that. So let's act in the right way, and fulfill your duties, fulfill your your desires, but on the highest level possible, to your highest potential, you might say. And nothing is lost. This is the thing about the spiritual path. People think of it in terms of I'm giving up. And Yogananda was not that way. He was embracive. He says, you're not giving up anything. He says, what you're doing is you're embracing everything. Don't approach the spiritual life as in a rejectionist mood, but embrace it in joy. So you're expanding your sense of who you are to include everything. And if you do it in the right way, those desires will be fulfilled in the right manner. So look at it from that point of view. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just taking the thread ahead of this yoga, I have one question.
Yes, sir.
You said that you can be born in different worlds depending on what consciousness level you have.
Yes, sir.
Okay, but then all those words are also part of this chakras of the yoga, or it is out of that, or it is the same?
He is asking about, I mentioned how Yogananda had said there are many worlds to be born in, and depending upon those which resonate with us according to our karma, and particularly the vibration. Those worlds, and now the question may be, are those physical worlds in this universe?
Yeah.
Or are they perhaps they're in alternate universes? Yogananda didn't specify. The implication when he answered that question is that there are many worlds in this physical universe to which one can, just as this earth is one, what he was saying is this physical earth is not the only habitable place for mankind or our type of being to live on. There are many other such worlds, but I do think the implication could also be that there are many dimensions of alternative realities also. That could be an alternate interpretation also. I think rather than either or, it might be both and. I think we're going to find in the years ahead, and I'm just speculating as my own speculation, is that there are many dimensions that we probably are simultaneously existing right now. There's, Loka, Bhuvar Loka, and all these different lokas. Where are they in physical space, or are they in another dimension of space? And these lokas, which are the scriptures say and the traditions say, they exist right now, but they're not a physical. They're a level of consciousness that is not three-dimensional. In terms of physicality. And those two, they have universes and places, like we read in the autobiography of a yogi how Swami Sri Yukteswar said he lived on an astral, was it a causal? Planet, Hiranyaloka. Now where is that? It's not, obviously the implication was it's not part of this physical universe. It was worlds on various levels of consciousness, different lokas. But also, I think the implication is in this loka that we find ourselves in, this also has many worlds within it, and we find that which resonates with our state of consciousness. And actually that's so. The Yogananda said that there are many worlds, and he says some of them are in very dark age type of existence, and some of them much more advanced than this. And it's beyond our ability right now in this age, but who's to say? As I mentioned, consciousness, as we move up from Dwapar into higher ages, change is accelerating. It's moving faster. And you can see that just in the few hundred years that have passed. So things very different now than when I was a child. And I think it is accelerating. So I would say both. Both. Yes, sir. And when am I supposed to end? Technically soon.
Right now.
So can one follow two different meditation techniques and teaching simultaneously, or is it counterproductive?
Okay. He's asking, can one follow two different meditation techniques, paths, traditions at the same time simultaneously? When we first start to explore what our particular direction and path is, it is not uncommon for people to test a little bit here, to test, because see, coming back to where we started, testing what works for you. What works for you? And so it's appropriate to test different traditions out. I would say it's probably going to be better for you to test them one at a time, though, rather than multiple ones at the same time, because then you're mixing things. It's like, many different types of ingredients into something. But as you're exploring, it's perfectly appropriate to look into Buddhism, Zen, this path, that path of meditation, what all the different ones, until you find that which resonates with you. And once you find something that resonates with you, then you should stick with it and go deep into it. Otherwise, you don't go beyond the surface, and you tend to be, you dabble, and but at a certain point, and you'll know, and they say, this is the one, this path resonates with me, and then you go deeper into it. So, but in the meantime, try one at a time. Just try this, and it works, doesn't work, or for you, and something you feel in the heart of what's going to attract you. So I think we should probably sum up here. And this afternoon we're going to have. I didn't want to go into specific techniques because that is reserved for workshops that we're going to have this afternoon. And if you're new to these teachings, we're going to have some practical techniques to share with you this afternoon. And I would recommend that you take one or two things, whether it's this path or whether it's another path. Take one or two things and give it full attention for an honest period of time, so that you could see if there's any merit to it. A little here, a little there. You have to go a certain amount of depth to give any tradition a chance, because we have to go beyond the surface of the restless mind. And so, if you're interested in these techniques, try them for give yourself a certain amount of time, and then look within yourself and see how you feel. Did it make any difference to you? Do you feel better? And sometimes we do not see ourselves as clearly as our friends and co-workers and others around us see us. Because sometimes we say, nothing's happening to me. And then somebody says, what are you doing? Something's changed about you. You seem calmer. Are you eating breakfast cereal now, or whatever? What is it that's changed? And you'll see, you'll have an effect around you that you may not always notice. So be sensitive to that. You can get feedback from your environment as to what's happening for you.